Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Base. Steve Hilton here. Kristen Garcia-Dumont is with me. Kristen, we got some great comments. We said at the end of the last episode we were going to dive into some of the comments, and we have done that, and it is just so amazing. We've been looking at them. What do you think? I've got one. I'm going to start with one because it's relevant to the topics we're going to be talking about today and the fantastic guest we have today.
Yeah, so read that one because then I got one I loved too.
Okay, fantastic. So this is from Callie Mom 39. Steve and Kristen, well, the title, let's just start with that because that's pretty good. The podcast Californians deserve. Fully agree with that. Steve and Kristen, thank you so much for your podcast. I have been drifting away from the left in horror at the COVID policies, especially the treatment of children. It hurts me and angers me so much as a Californian to be told by rich. Wait, where's this go? Oh, I didn't see that. Well, is that the end of it?
No.
It cuts off. I can't see the rest of it. It was going so well.
To just leave the state and be abandoned as a lost cause. Thank you for speaking up for reasonable policies and not condescending to those of us who cannot or will not leave our homes. I appreciate it so much. I've learned a lot from the show. Love the one on homelessness. Just donated to Let Them Breathe GoFundMe. Felt great. May they prevail. I love the fighting spirit in that one.
I'm glad there's someone competent here that can actually read things out properly. Very good. Okay. Did you have one too?
Yes. Okay. Well, I love the title of this one too, from Leaner1263. Alive again. Because isn't that the whole point of what we're trying to do here is breathe life into sort of the fight, the rebellion out of California, saying back to common sense. Right. Says, I was ready to move out of California after the recall, but after hearing the episode about why not to move, I'm recharged and inspired. I'm new to politics, and it's because of people like you that I started to pay attention and keep engaged. Thanks for what you do. I'm in. That is great.
Gosh.
Thank you,
So
Lena.
that is a heavy responsibility. We now have to deliver. We have to deliver the revolution that we're talking about here at the Rebel Base. That's fantastic. Honestly, it really made me so happy to read these. We'll do a couple more later, and we'll let you know where you can stay in touch with us, because we are building a movement here to change the insanity of what's going on, as we always say. And it looks like a lot of you are that's really resonating with a lot of you. And that's just makes me so happy, Kristen, as well. So first of all, make sure, you stay part of that movement and tell all your friends and family and everyone you can think of. So follow us at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Let's get to our guest today. Really excited to talk to Justin Hart, who's based in San Diego. If you're down in that area, I'm sure you've seen and heard him on local media. Justin, how are you doing? You describe yourself as a data scientist who's got I want to say, I don't think you use this term, but you kind of radicalized by the insane response to the pandemic. Tell us a little bit about what your background is, and then we'll get to some of the details that you've been focusing on in terms of the state's COVID response.
Yeah, my background has spanned many industries, but my forte is taking data that a company has and making it make sense to their executives. So I'll come in, I'll build some dashboards, we'll do some deep dive analytics. We may even throw in a little AI, a little machine learning. And at the beginning of 2020, I had a pretty good clientele going. I'm originally from the Bay Area, but my wife is down here in San Diego. Mm-hmm. Both of us are 3 and 4 generations deep into California. So this is home, and it's very difficult to see things go to pot that way. So all of a sudden, when the shutdown came, I had a couple clients, mostly in the leisure sphere. One of them was golf excursions for baby boomers, dead. Next one was families consulting, wanting to send their kids to college, dead. And the last one was high-end vacation club for families looking to get, it was all dead. All my clients were dead. Right. And so I had a little time on my hand, and I thought, you know what? I wonder what's happening with this virus. Why is this affecting me so? Because, look, I'm not a virologist. I'm not an epidemiologist, but I'm a darn good data guy. And normally I wouldn't insert myself into someone else's domain, but they sure seem to have no problem inserting themselves into my life, my business, my kids' education, my health, my church, my business. It's just insane. And so I thought, let me check the math and make sure we're on the same page. Turns out the math is all wrong. And that's what kind of brought us to where I am now. It's basically a ragtag bunch of data analysts, concerned citizens, activists who basically have had it up to here and are ready to move on from this pandemic and have all the data to show that we're really, really reacting the very wrong way.
Yeah, and it all started with bad data in the very beginning, right? That initial model that said the death rate was going to be, I can't even remember. It was astronomically high.
So can I just jump? Exactly, right. Sorry to cut you off.
But that's okay.
And it was with the UK, wasn't it? It was that absolute maniac in the UK, Imperial College, wasn't it?
Yes.
They had some model. They said like millions of people in the UK were going to die. Then, the people in the White House said, "Oh my God, we got to do something," because then it started being translated into US deaths of multiple millions. You're exactly right. I'd completely forgotten about that.
And that guy had been wrong so many times. Like Imperial College and that guy in particular had been wrong so many times. Why we ever trusted someone who's routinely wrong in their modeling was crazy. And everyone should have been very alarmed when he wouldn't turn over his code or show how he had actually done any of these models, because people wanted to see and check.
Yeah. And by the way, wasn't he also the one, I don't know, someone can check this, but who got caught later on during the UK lockdowns, having an affair, with this woman in his apartment when people were supposed to be, it was him, wasn't it? It was
the kissing exception.
Come on. It's great Neil Ferguson. And in fact, right now, he is out there.
Felt the spirit.
He's out there decrying that there's going to be another 100,000 people a day who could get infected on his projections there. Look, the deal is that most people can visualize this. If you have any experience in online marketing or just a business in general, right? It's kind of like a funnel is what we say. You start at the top and you have people that come to your website. Maybe you grab their email address. So now they're a lead, as they're commonly known. And then a lead turns into an opportunity where they might become a paying customer. And then you have your customers. So it narrows down like that. Well, the CDC looks at this stuff in a very similar way. When they look at an influenza season, they say, well, how many people got sick? How many people got tested and actually verified for influenza? And then how many people had to be hospitalized? And then how many people died? And so what you do is you take that how many people died and you divide it by how many people got infected. And that gives you that rate that is common for influenza, which is 0.14. That is, out of 100 people, 0.14 people will die from influenza, and typically on an older age range. Well, they were saying...
Is that what they call the case fatality rate?
The case fatality rate. That's correct. And so they would look at that and they would say, well, wait a minute. We're looking at 3%. That is that 3 out of every 100 people that get this will die. That was the number that was coming out. And then Dr. Fauci lowered it a little bit. But in front of Congress, he actually said that 1 out of 100 people will die. And he was confusing the rate here of people dying to people actually getting tested positive there. Because we know that for coronavirus especially, there's a lot of people that don't even know they have it. And so it's sometimes a factor of 3 or 4 on top of the people that get tested, which is really unfortunate. So at the very outset, bad numbers were driving this. And unfortunately, we started treating it like an election. The CDC itself would say, listen, don't trust our numbers except for a year or 2 out. And here we were asking them to turn around and provide this like votes overnight. So we shouldn't be surprised when we end up with hanging chads and a big bag of cases from Broward County type of thing.
But look, the thing is that what I just would love your sort of take on this, because they were, whilst you're right, so they were putting out sort of bad numbers, and they also didn't you have the Washington model, whatever, that everyone, all these models and these lines going up and whatever. But the basic facts about this disease were known very early on. I mean, I remember on my Fox show, I got a lot of crap for it. Like we were the first, including on Fox. You had a bunch of other people even on Fox running around being, in my view, hysterical about the virus and sort of, running to go and see President Trump and say, you've got to do something. You know what I mean? Like really whipping up the hysteria on Fox. And we were the only one that actually had people on, like Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford University and others, who actually, we're saying, we know the facts of this, about this virus. We know that it doesn't affect everyone universally. There's very clear dependence on your age and health condition. And also we know, I mean, this is a quote I remember putting on screen, playing the tape over and over again from the public health, I can't remember her exact title, but the California, it was Dr. Sonia Angel. I don't think she's there anymore. She was either the public health director or something. And I just remember the phrase so clearly because it's so stark. She said, over 80% of people who get this disease will have mild or zero symptoms. Like, they were saying that at the beginning. We knew all this at the beginning. It wasn't like this was all discovered later.
Yeah, that's the difficult thing, is we know the general risks that are involved here. In a very fortunate way, COVID spares our children, which is not something we can say about influenza or even the 1918 pandemic. The average age of someone dying in the 1918 pandemic was 29 years old. So imagine a bunch of teenagers and a bunch of 20-year-olds dying suddenly and in vast amounts here in the country. I'm sure my reaction would be very frenetic. I have kids. I would be very worried as well. But when the median age of death is exactly the median age of death of dying of anything else, then you have some problems. So from the beginning of January to now, about 60,000 children have died in the United States. That's just of anything. And about less than one...
January which year? 2020
From
or
2020 to 2021, people under the age of 18 who typically don't die, there have been 60,000 deaths of anything else other than COVID. There have been about 500 to 600 deaths of children along that same 24-month period there as well. So when we're looking at this, you have to understand that the risks to children are very small and the risks to elderly are very great. And so we try to put it in context. So we have some posters, for example, at our website at rationalground.com, where we talk about the different risks. For a child, for example, you have a better risk of getting hit by lightning than dying of COVID. For a healthy woman under the age of 40, you have a better chance of dying in a plane crash. If you have a
better chance of getting murdered.
Yeah. And so,
like the homicide
especially
rate.
now.
It's ridiculous. I mean, drowning in a pool. But nobody talks about these statistics because everybody's bad at data. And you even back to the...
And then you have the flip side of the coin, which is really unfortunate. This is something that Dr. Scott Atlas was bringing out very prominently, is that you don't realize the impact that the shutdown has. I got a text message from a friend of mine in Orange County. This is late last year. He said, Justin, my dad just passed away. My mom passed away 4 months earlier. And they didn't die of COVID. They died because they were too scared to go to the hospital. And they both had diseases that they couldn't get diagnosed because they were too scared of catching COVID. And we saw that again and again. 50% of all cancers went undiagnosed in the spring of last year. And then the stat that really gets me, because it's the flip side of closing schools, which is we think across the country about 250,000 cases of child abuse were missed. Why? Because it's typically wide-eyed administrators and teachers who catch those things, and the kids weren't in school.
Wait, 250,000 cases?
250,000 cases. That's just over from like March to May. Because we know that there are alleged cases of abuse that are typically found over the course of several months. And what we found is that when you actually digest the information, this was out of the University of Michigan, University of Florida, that did a study, and they said typically over that 3 to 4 month period, you would see about 250,000 cases of alleged domestic abuse, either towards the child or towards the mother. And again, it's teachers catching those clues and reporting those incidents. Those didn't get caught.
So I just want to understand that, because that's a huge... I remember, and going back now to, last 2020, when I was sort of fighting these insane lockdowns, and we were trying to marshal all the data about the cost of the lockdowns. I was putting it up on screen every week, and it was very hard to get the numbers. Obviously the numbers on jobs and so on were readily available. And the numbers on the sort of, the fiscal cost of the bailouts and whatever. But the chart, some of these more tangible ones were just, it was hard to get the numbers. That 250,000, I'll be really clear and we sort of made the point rather than put up numbers, because we couldn't find anything. So on that, I just want to really understand that, because it's a really big deal. So is that an extrapolation? Therefore, that 250,000, and you said it was March to May. So are you saying that's like just in 2 months, and you multiply that by 6 to get an annual? Or what, can you just talk about that number a bit?
Yeah, it was a study out of the University of Michigan and also in conjunction with the University, I believe, in Florida. And what they determined is typically when you look at case records across the entire country, where we have millions and millions of students, over that course of 3 to 4 months, you would typically see about 250 alleged cases of child abuse or domestic abuse reported. Sometimes they can see the bruises on mothers and everything else there, and it doesn't involve the kids. But it's teachers. Teachers report those things because they have that daily outside interaction from the family, and kids weren't in school. And that sort of impact has a dramatic impact on our kids when you talk about just that number in general. No one, just in short though, no one thought about the cost benefit analysis of shutting these things down.
No, I get it. So, but what would be, I just want to pin you down on the number. So what would be if you had to say, okay, what the total, of course this is an estimate, but we now know, looking back, the school closures went over a certain period around the country. If you added all that up around the country, the different school closures, is there a number we could say, like a reasonable estimate of the cases of domestic violence and abuse that were missed because of the school closures is this figure? I mean, what would that figure look like?
I don't know. I'll have to go back to you on that. But at the same time, when I look over the states, there are still schools that are closed down, believe it or not. A lot of schools in hybrid learning. And so it's just it's a devastating thing that we're going to be picking up the pieces.
They close them at the drop of a hat. One case and they shut the school. It's insane.
Well, you think about the policy.
But doesn't that also make the point about risk benefit that you guys are talking about, which is the fact that data is hard to find?
Yeah,
tells
look,
you that
totally right.
We're not doing a cost benefit analysis because we don't care about the costs. There's just a singular agenda to push the vaccine.
Yeah, and think about just the policies in general. We know the lockdown policies that some of the key sort of risks that you have towards COVID are, one, are you obese? And two, a lack of vitamin D. It turns out vitamin D is a crucial component to keep your body fit and figured there. And so whose idea was it to lock us in our house outside of the sun, getting takeout to get fat and put on our COVID-19
in California and close the parks and the beaches?
And the gyms.
My God.
Yeah, I have this. I have this picture of my daughter, and she's standing there really upset, holding the swing at her favorite park because they padlocked it so she couldn't use it for 6 months.
I know. I remembered very vividly. One of my most vivid memories of the whole thing was walking with a friend down in LA with their young child. I think it would have been about 2 at the time, to his favorite, the local, exactly as you described, the local little playground area, the swing set and stuff. And as we were walking towards it, it was in the first week of the lockdowns, just when, ridiculous Santa Clara County, Sarah Cody had started it here in the Bay Area where Kristen and I live. And then it was all 8 Bay Area counties. And then Newsom announced it for the whole state. And so you had that 1 week where they were kind of, getting ready for it. And we were walking towards the playground. And as we were walking, literally you could see the guy with the danger tape, the yellow tape, taping it up in front of us as we arrived and locking it. And we're like, what's going on? And he thought it was as stupid as anyone else. But he said, I've been told to do it. Obviously we're not going to argue, going to get him in trouble. But the whole thing, I totally agree with you. It was just so... Oh my God! You're reminding me how.
Yeah, well, you can picture that video of the guy
in
Huntington Beach that they're chasing down because he's paddleboarding during the shutdown, right? I mean, this was really drastic, and I think the problem is that it's the pandemic and the response is a very localized experience. I tell my brothers and sisters out in Utah or elsewhere, I say, you have no idea what it's like, and they really don't, because it's a very, very exclusive sort of, you can go 10 miles inland here in San Diego, no one's wearing masks at the supermarket, but here around my place, it's not required, but 80% of people are still wearing masks. And I think the big problem that people have is people are willing to make sacrifices if in the end it works out that helped, right? What people are greatly inconvenienced by is when they're inconvenienced by these shutdowns and they didn't do anything. We put up a chart today on Twitter showing Los Angeles County, Orange County, San Diego County, right on top of each other geographically, right? Los Angeles, you can't go into a 7-Eleven without wearing a mask. Orange County, really lax. They don't really care. San Diego, kind of in between. But the case rates, the hospitalization rates, the death rates, almost exactly the same. The MPIs, you might as well just put forth your arm to stop the Mississippi as you would to stop a respiratory pathogen pandemic that's going on.
Exactly.
Justin,
right.
can you go back and talk about the the risk stratification based on age? We talked about it a little bit.
Yes,
We
I
didn't
was
get
going to
into
ask
the
the
data.
same question, Kristen. Look at that. We are on the same wavelength.
Sure.
Totally.
One
We're
quick
aligned
way
today.
to think about it, and this just sort of cuts it into two pieces, which is, and this is from John Ioannidis, who is the most cited living scientist out of Stanford, and he had a very simple way to.
We can't mention him. He's been cancelled.
Yeah,
YouTube will take us down if you mention him.
So he's got two things. One is if you're under the age of 65, your risks of COVID or dying of COVID are about the same as dying on your commute to work in a car over 6 months to a 12-month period. And if you're over the age of 65, they're slightly higher. They're about the same risks that you incur if you were a professional truck driver. So much more deadly than just a regular commuter, but still in that realm where it's not outrageous. Now, another way you can convey your personal risks is just by 20-year increments. So we know the average age of death is about 80 years old. So for every 20 years underneath that, you can reduce your risk by 10 times. So if you're 60 years old, your risk of dying of COVID are 10 times lower than an 80-year-old. If you're 40 years old, now we're doing multiplication. It's actually 100 times lower than an 80-year-old. So if you're half the age of an 80-year-old, you have 100 times lower risk of dying. If you're a 20-year-old, your risk of dying of COVID compared to an 80-year-old is 1,000 times lower. And when we get to our kids, it's 10,000 times lower than the average age of death. So you can convey that for your own personal purposes or for your neighbor or friends, and just let them know that the risks when you get under the age of 60 are fairly low and significantly go when you get under the age of 20.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge. Look, there's an old apocryphal story that's passed down through rabbinic tradition that I heard about one time about the people of Noah and the wicked people that were outside the boat, didn't make it on the boat, right? And when the waters came up to their waist, they held their children to their hips. When the waters came up to their necks, they put their kids on their shoulders. But when the waters came up to their chins, they put their kids under their feet so they could live. And it's a terrible, awful, evil story, but it's analogous to what we have today, which is our kids are the one people that we're now masking up, making them eat outside, cold on the ground. It's dreadful what we've done to these kids to allay our fears.
Can I just I just want to sort of make a note here because this is such a great conversation. I just want to sort of put two kind of structural points in here. So first of all, what we've been talking about so far, I think, is you could put under the general category of complete data-driven destruction of the argument that we should have had what we ended up with, which is this universal strategy.
Correct.
Equal application to everyone, the universal lockdown. Instead of that, we should have had a much more tailored, targeted approach based on actual risk, based on the data. That's the kind of category we've been in. I'd love to make sure we have time to talk about some of the more specific things and get your insights on the data there, particularly, some of the more individual components of the recommendations, especially masks. I want to get to that in a second. But the other point I wanted to make was at the end of this conversation, I want to talk to you about learning the lessons, having some kind of evaluation, because it seems to me that there's absolutely none of that going on. They're just sort of, just in the UK, just recently, they sort of, the first sign of what is trouble, they go back to the same old stupid lockdowns. And there's a sense that you might get it here as well. And certainly that's what you're seeing. That's the instinct in California. But so I want to sort of wrap up with that. Like, how do we get a proper evaluation? But I want to dive into one specific immediately, because it's one that I've really just been so enraged about, the way that they constantly accuse people who challenge the groupthink of spreading misinformation. I think it seems to be the biggest piece of misinformation is this, amongst many, I guess, is this idea that masks, the cloth masks that we're all sort of instructed to wear, actually work. And here I'm really interested in a specific piece of data that I heard you mention, and it was in the same ballpark as the figure that I give out, but you had a slightly different number. So I have been saying, based on some studies that I read and people like Dr. Michael Osterholm, who's actually not he's NBC's virus guy. He's not like some, crazy Fox News, like lockdown skeptic. He was very skeptical of masks. I've read some of the studies of cloth masks, not all masks, not N95s or anything, not just general, but the cloth mask that we're all supposed to wear the whole time. And the number that I had was that basically your standard cloth masks keep out 3%. They interrupt 3% of the virus. That's all it does. I heard you say 9%. So I was just really interested in what you've read and where your data comes from, and just talk about the whole issue of masks, because it's become such a kind of symbol of the craziness. I'd love to hear your data analysis on masks.
Well, as you noted, there's nothing new under the sun. This is something that they struggled with in the 1918 pandemic. In fact, there's this great headline that said the other day was masks are the greatest friend of the disease, right? And it went through and talked about it. Well, that was written in 1918 in a Santa Barbara newspaper. Again and again, we see that masks basically become a political tool because it's very tangible, right? And what politicians like is something that they can control, which is, oh, cases are going up. You're not masking hard enough. And cases are going down. Thank you for masking, right? The data out there on masks is mixed at best and awful at on reality's face. So when we look at it, a cloth mask, because the micronic size of the viral particle will just slip right through most anything there, okay? Especially our initial thoughts were, well, most of the sort of spittle and the stuff that comes out with us is what's causing the transmission. Well, the numbers just don't support that. And we knew early on, I believe even as late as early as May of last year, that aerosolization was probably the root transmission of this, right? And so those cloth masks are not going to do anything. The stat I usually have is that within seconds, you have 60 to 90% penetration of cloth masks, of anything that goes in and out. And again, the idea was that masks were never intended to protect you as aware. They were intended to protect someone else. But they don't do a terribly good job at that, especially in an aerosolized pathogen that SARS-CoV-2 seems to be. So the data that we have, for example, there was a very large front page of the opinion piece article from the New York Times that said, masks worked, with a big trophy ahead of it. And it was based on a study out of Bangladesh. It was a really interesting approach, which is they took a bunch of villages, about 350,000 people in those coercive villages. They split them in half, and they said, all right, half of you we're not going to do anything with, and half of you we're going to put in surgical masks, right? And so they did tests. And
they're the paper ones. When people say surgical masks, they're the
right,
sort of
the paper ones that you see, right?
The little blue
yeah,
paper
the cheap ones
yeah.
that you get there, too. So they had that. They had education for that group about social distancing or whatnot. So they came out about 340,000 people. They came out to about 1,500 cases in each, and the difference was 20 cases. So they didn't release those numbers at the outset.
But they didn't. Yeah, they didn't release those numbers in the beginning.
Yeah, at the outset they just basically
those numbers just came out.
They used it basically as a background thing to say, it reduced for 50-year-olds that were wearing masks. It reduced them by 33%. It was a bunch of nonsense. They got caught red-handed once they released the data, and we see that again and again. Is that the people are just grasping at straws to find anything that works. There's an account that Dr. Atlas recounts where he's in the Oval Office with President Trump and Dr. Birx, and they're describing how the cases went down in Arizona. And Dr. Birx says, you see, masks work. And it was one thing Dr. Atlas just confronted her right there and then, and he said, President Trump, the masks had nothing to do with it. You can see it. He went through all the data points and how it already peaked. And so we see again and again, just compare Los Angeles to Orange County. Masks to the hilt in LA, people 90% wearing masks outside. It makes no difference. When you look at schools, and this is going to be we'll have all the data here by the end of the year, but of course the main people will just ignore it, which is 6 months worth of schooling with kids in masks in California and kids outside of masks in Florida, the exact same case rate. It made no difference whatsoever. And that's the terrible thing, is that the last bastion of the masks is really our kids. I
just want to keep going on masks because it's such a powerful symbol of the insanity. Okay, so they point to, again, I just want to kind of re-emphasize what I said earlier. In case the censors at YouTube are watching, and I want to talk about that in a second, because I'm right in saying, aren't I, that the sort of cardboard ones, they're really serious, the N95 masks, they do stop the aerosolized particles. So if you had a policy of wearing that, and I remember at the early stages of this, when we were arguing for a kind of protect the vulnerable focus protection, whatever you want to call it, the kind of Great Barrington Declaration strategy, Jay Bhattacharya, Ioannidis, and that those people were pushing forward. And I was, arguing for that as well. Back in March last year, we said, actually, if you want to use masks, you should, to protect the elderly, have them wear their N95s, whatever. It's not all masks are the same. The cloth mask that we all wear. But YouTube literally has a policy as that you cannot question the effectiveness of masks.
Yeah, it's
and so
difficult.
This conversation we're having
is dangerous.
Literally now, and if you hear the way that people talk about it, who are kind of committed to it, you can't persuade. Where's it come from? They all. You've pointed to some studies. And I've had this conversation with people, and they say, well, studies show, and everyone just says studies show, right? Why isn't there somewhere where you can have, and obviously, logically it stands to reason when you've got an aerosolized thing, that passes through the air, and people have made comparisons with smells, like if you can smell something through the mask, that's how the virus travels, because it's aerosolized, it goes in the air, like an odor. And so, it kind of logically makes sense, but how do you win this argument? How do we win it with YouTube, for example, who is saying as a question of policy, you cannot say that you cannot question the effectiveness of masks.
Yeah, I told the team early front when we had this sort of ragtag team of people, what do we do about masks? We were very passionate about it, but I told them we'll probably lose this one, and we'll probably lose it because there's just it fits naturally with our culture that prizes virtue signaling above many other things. And I think also, look, for most of the people in the pandemic, they've sacrificed a lot. I mean, 2 years of your kids' education, maybe you lost your job. To come out now and somehow admit that it was worth nothing is a really tough pill to swallow. It's certainly tough for the people whose policies they implemented, but for the general person, there's a lot of saving face going on. And so they're trying to grasp on to that last part of it. That's at least my psychological evaluation for what it's worth. But when we look down to the data, again, you just have to compare it. And all this data is readily available. You say, pull up any county that had no mask mandate, and then pull up another county of a similar age that had a mask mandate. You realize there's little to no difference. And in the end, we know that, the cloth masks
but
don't
people
work.
say, no. I get it. But people say, I'd just love you to respond to this argument. Well, if you look at Asian countries where mask wearing, when you have a cold to protect others, is part of culture and normal everyday practice, you have, the results, they had a much better pandemic, lower rates, lower deaths per population, and so on. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, when you look at the countries that they signal out, let's say Singapore, Japan, Taiwan, who are going through their biggest case rates right now. I mean, it's up 2,000% in some ways in Taiwan, in Korea, in a couple other places as well. Massive, massive case growth that they're seeing there. But more importantly, we think that one of the things that we're finding with the COVID virus, with SARS-CoV-2, is that it's been around a lot longer than we think. And that a lot of these countries where they didn't get hit as hard may have gone through it and they may not have known it. We know that it was here at least from mid-year 2019. By one estimation, it could have been here many years beforehand, just based on the population. The Omicron variant has been just a thorn, a crazy little mess. But the one thing it has revealed is that the genetic sort of jump that it made, the evolutionary hop that you see from Alpha onto Omicron, was so vast that there's no way to explain it except that SARS-CoV-2 had been here a lot longer than people expected. And so it's very possible that even in New Zealand and Australia, certainly in some of the Asian countries there, that they had already gone through it and they didn't know it. The only reason that we're still in this thing is because we have a little trigger, a little buzzer on every single case that's out there. And all these cases originate at the county level. So let's say, for example, if you were in a county and you heard that someone died of COVID, you wouldn't think twice of it. You think, okay, well, one person died. I get it. People die all the time, right? We have 3,000 counties in the United States, and that's where all the reporting starts. So imagine just one person died of COVID every day in every single county. That's 3,000 deaths a day, right? So it all begins at these little beacons across the country, and we're watching those very carefully. This is really an issue where all of the data, whether it's on masks or whether it's on cases or hospitalizations, is a mess. And that's one thing that we're hoping to solve once this gets over with.
How much data do we even have on Omicron? Because I hear a lot of conclusions already about it.
Well, the one difference
seems
between,
a little quick to have any conclusions.
Well, the one difference between Omicron and the other variants is that for the other variants, they would do some samples of the swabs, and they would say, well, we see that from those samples, a percentage are Delta. In fact, 80% are Delta. That's taken over, right? But for Omicron, and this is where it's going to get fun, they figured out how to turn the PCR tests to actually catch an Omicron case. So now we can count how many Omicron cases there are instead of just sampling. And I guarantee you the New York Times is working on heat maps and everything else to basically show here's how many Omicron cases are popping up. But I'm really glad because to date, over the last 3 weeks since it was announced, there hasn't been quite the rush. I think it was there for the first week, but then people realized this is just another cry wolf moment. We're not going to be dealing with this again.
Well, sorry, you need to double click on that for me. So the PCR test is a methodology just where you're multiplying essentially whatever the sample is in order to see if something appears like it's present. Yeah. You're saying that now there's some way for them that the sequence of that genome for Omicron is so unique that they're able to test specifically for Omicron?
That's correct. So before, to genomically sequence a virus, you take one of the swabs and you go through a whole process. It's pretty lengthy. And then they say, okay, out of 100 swabs we took from these people, 80% are Delta. Well, now for Omicron, there's a missing piece on the protein. And if you arrange the PCR test, the one that you usually do to get a test at your local county, whatever else there, you can usually spot that missing deleted S gene, and that indicates that it is Omicron. So not only are we going to have, the percentage of variants is Delta and Omicron, we're going to have the actual counts now, which is going to be a whole nother mess.
I'm sorry.
Okay,
Okay, go on. You go.
I was just going to say, can I say something controversial, though, which is, since it's mild, why are we trying to stop it? Like, shouldn't we say, let's all inhale it as quickly as we can? It's a variant that is very low risk across age groups. So let's all get as much immunity as we possibly can. Why would we be shutting down a very, very mild variant?
Look, that's the rube of this entire thing. We knew who was at risk. We could have chose to protect them. We chose to protect everybody and ended up protecting nobody. And that's kind of just, we have a lack of political will.
That's exactly right. And by the way, that's why everyone says, because Trump people didn't wear masks, America has a very high death rate. If you look at the data on deaths per 100,000, by the way, and just assume that data is correct, which I'm sure it isn't. We haven't even talked about the actually, I do want to talk about this. Sorry, there's so much. I will go a little bit.
There's so many.
We're going to go over a little bit over time, I think, because there's so much to still I want to talk to you about. So the deaths with and deaths of thing. Okay, so let's just talk about that, because do you remember back in when it was Trump in the White House? And people would say, well, but, people are going into hospital for something completely different and they're getting tested, and if they have a positive test, that is recorded as a coronavirus case. And if they then die, that's recorded as having died of the virus. Whereas in fact, they died of whatever they came in with. They just happened to have the virus. So that deaths with, deaths of. And then all the kind of lefty groupthink people say that's just, ridiculous, trying to kind of, massage away the appalling Trump performance, whatever. I noticed that the minute that Biden gets in, you literally had Rochelle Walensky. I remember seeing this, in the early days of the vaccination plan, when people were talking about breakthrough. I don't think they used the term there, but, breakthrough cases of people dying who'd been vaccinated. She then comes out and says, Jake Tapper or whoever she's talking to, you have to distinguish between deaths with the virus and deaths of. And a lot of those people that are vaccinated going to hospital,
the irony,
they're dying of whatever they went in. It's so self-serving. The whole thing is so outrageous. But you've got some data on this, right? About the deaths with and deaths of. So let's just talk about that.
So my team members last summer had the opportunity to go in and actually physically examine 700 redacted death certificates that were de-itemized. So we don't have the people's names, but we had everything they die of. And when you look at a death certificate, there's like two parts. The first part is everything that led to the death. and then everything that contributed to it is the second part, right? And so we would see that about 30% of these death certificates were just filled out really lazily. It just said COVID-19 and 80 years old, 89 years old. It's like, okay, someone just didn't do their job, because obviously if you're 89 years old, you have a lot of comorbidities that are coming into play. But we found that at least half of those things should never have been coded as COVID specific. It was like 78-year-old woman, fall from a ladder, broken femur, COVID, right? And so we would see these things again and again, and you realize very quickly that the PCR test that we have is so sensitive that it can pick up a virus from 5 days or 75 days ago. And the way that they had the system set up, it was just like a drop of a pin, and it would fill it and say, oh, you got COVID, right? And then that would trickle through to the COVID's patient. And then based on the differing county policies, if someone got COVID, let's say 3 months ago, and recovered, but is now dying of something, they're still treated like a COVID patient, right? And so all these things go into play, and it gets really messy. So here in San Diego, for example, one of the big hospital conglomerates down here, I won't mention their name, but I have insiders sending me their policy documents. So if someone goes into the hospital, let's say with like an ingrown toenail that needs some ER help on it, right? And they're not vaccinated, they test the person. If that person happens to test positive for COVID patient, right? And someone goes in there and they're fully vaccinated, same toenail issue, they don't test them at all. So you got these differing sort of approaches, and now the numbers are all mixed up. So it's a mess. And we think on the death side that there's a very good qualifiable support to say that we definitely are not at 700,000 deaths directly supported to COVID-19. And again, when you're dealing with people in the average age...
Do you have any estimate of how many it actually is? Do you have any?
We think the range can be as low as about 300,000 over the past 2 years, versus it could go the other way too. Those are just sort of the estimate ranges that you have. This was again done by John Ioannidis to understand exactly where things were. Was it overcounted or was it undercounted? And the way that we look at this is what we call excess deaths, right? This is a term that's been thrown around, but it's the best measure to understand the impact of a virus. That is to say, a certain amount of people die every year. 8,000 people die in the United States every day. 40,000 people die in nursing homes every month, right? And so you add those all up, and it gets down to about 2 to 3 million people that die every year. And so we expected a certain amount of people to die in 2020, and then we see that there are bursts of other deaths that we didn't account for, and those we believe are some of the COVID deaths. But we also see a big burst, for example, here in California. There are about 5,000 deaths of people between the ages of 20 and 40 that we can't account for COVID, right? Because we have there are about 8,000 people that died over the last 2 years here in California that are between the ages of, I believe, 20 and 60, okay? But of those deaths, we only have about 5,000 of them that we think were COVID. And so there's 3 to 10 to 5,000 deaths, and numbers are crazy, where we don't know exactly what caused that death, but it wasn't COVID. We think that's lockdown related. We think a lot of those could have been, for example, myocarditis from vaccine adverse reactions or otherwise.
Or how about the fact that they wouldn't release for the longest time the children who died supposedly of COVID with COVID? I'm not sure which one they were saying. For a long time, they wouldn't reveal the data that these children had really significant comorbidities.
Of course.
So their death was not of COVID, but they terrified parents in the meantime, and they know the lie goes all the way around the world, and everybody's repeating it, and nobody's actually believing the correction.
Yeah.
So did the New York Times go back and say, just kidding, that India study was a total farce. It was the problem with small denominators. And so they messed with you guys by saying percentages and didn't tell you how tiny the denominator was. So masks don't work, right? Did they ever go back and say, hey guys, cover of the New York Times, kids actually don't die from COVID? Why are we trying to terrorize parents with bad data?
Well, there was this
is what I don't understand.
Can I just throw in there just quickly? Marty McCary from Johns Hopkins, who I've had on the air a lot to talk sense about all this. He wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal. People can look it up, where he was making exactly the same point as you, Justin, about the how poor the data is on kids, and Kristen as well. The data is very poor, but he nationally in America. But he said if you actually look at one subset, I can't remember what it was now, whether it was one city or county or something. If you look at the what they report, or one hospital system maybe, what they report as child deaths from COVID, if you actually look at it and you look at the specific comorbidities in each case, you come to the conclusion that not a single child, it's not just low numbers, like in the hundreds, not the thousands, zero. The actual number, that's what he said. It's perfectly possible that the total number of children who died from COVID is zero. But we don't have the proper data.
Yeah, and when they do come out with the data, it's very terrifying. They say, for example, for males between the ages of 11 and 17, if they vaccinate 1 million of those, they will reduce the ICUs of about 60 people. That is, 60 people would not go into the ICUs because they would have caught COVID otherwise. But on the flip side, because of myocarditis and the actual adverse reactions from the virus, from the vaccine to those younger cohorts, male cohorts between the ages of 11 and 17, 57 of those people would end up at the ICU anyways. And so this is this terrible trade-off that no one seems to be addressing.
Yeah.
And it's all based on fear. I think, look, there's a bias register that the media has on right and left, and that also goes towards virtue signaling and fear-mongering. There was a very...
Yes, and there's always been a ratchet. There's always been just from my time in politics and government, this is what, good, strong leaders resist this and tell the truth. But there's a ratchet, which is between the media and the politicians. And that's why actually you've seen these lunatic policies, lockdowns and so on, these blanket universal lockdowns applied almost regardless of political ideology. You've seen kind of lefty people here do it, in California, for example, but you've also seen the so-called conservative government in the UK with Boris Johnson do insane lockdowns. I mean, and absolutely ludicrous restrictions on freedom. I remember the thing that brought it home to me was the point about there was one when they were relaxing restrictions, okay, and they were making, and I read some newspaper article in the UK press that said from Monday, I'm not making this up, from Monday, people will be allowed to hug someone or sit on a park bench with someone from a different household. Like, you think, what the fuck is going on where they're making rules about sitting on park benches or hugging? Like, it's insane. The point I was going to make is this ratchet that goes on, which is the media, that you never get criticized for doing too much. You get criticized for not doing enough. So it's always kind of, well, what did you do? And, if you did nothing and then people died, then you're going to get the blame. Whereas, the overreaction, it's just you're safer. It's a CYA, I guess. It's sort of a grand global version of cover your ass, because you just think, well, I don't want the media to turn around and say, well, if you'd have done a lockdown like they did in wherever, Denmark or whatever, then 1,000 British people wouldn't have died last week. That's what they're frightened of. So it's the role of the press is really important in all this. And the other point I wanted to make about just the psychology of this from the point of view of the politicians and the leaders implementing all this, just, knowing them and the bureaucrats as well, the people like Fauci and these public health officials or whatever. People often say, they're power crazed, okay? They love the power. They don't want to let go. That's true, okay? But there's another aspect to it, which is more subtle and in a way I think could be more important, which is not so much they love the power, they love the drama, okay?
Yes.
They love the drama of being the sort of center of attention, and they have their press conference. Everyone's sort of, tuning in to hear the latest kind of announcements about the, what they've decided to do with their experts, and their, that sense of being really important and solving a problem, whatever. That kind of aspect of it is psychologically so important. That's what they don't want to let go of. You can absolutely see that with Fauci, sort of any opportunity to get on the media, sort of, running around, sort of, he's the guy that knows everything and everyone's sort of hanging on his every word. Dr. Fauci, is Omicron going to kill us all? No, it's fine. That drama. That's what they love. That's what's so sickening about it, this kind of narcissism of these people. And they're running around doing this and imposing it on everyone else, and real lives are being hurt. So they can sort of swan around having press conferences and preening themselves on the media.
Yeah, look, this is
and
their
just
Super
before
Bowl,
you respond
right?
to that, I want to hear that point, because that's a great point, which is, and then people who want to participate in that drama. So you've got, the parents. I dropped my daughter off at a party, and the kids had they're little kids. They had T-shirts that said "Vaxxed and Happy," And she clearly wanted to demonstrate, like, oh, I'm so great. I'm part of the savior class.
Right.
I've vaccinated my child, right? So because we got so far from the data, we're not saying, okay, a 70-year-old who has comorbidities, get vaccinated. Like, you should get vaccinated.
Exactly.
We divorced that from a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old. Parents so want to be part of this drama you're talking about,
savior
Steve.
class. That's a
the
brilliant
savior
phrase.
class, right? Yeah. It's really a problem.
No, it's true.
Sorry,
and for
ahead,
Dr.
Justin.
Fauci, you know, this is their Super Bowl, right? This comes once in a century, and they just want to see them. You know, he sees himself as Dustin Hoffman in that Contagion movie or whatever it was, when in actuality, he's kind of like the jerk in Ghostbusters, the EPA guy who messes everything up, right? I mean, that's really the fact of where he is. And, you know, he's in these emails, he's talking about who's going to play me in the movies. He's already talking about his leading roles.
Oh, it's disgusting.
And he doesn't learn from any of this as well. And I think the key problem was, you know, a lot of people gave Dr. Atlas some crap because he wasn't an epidemiologist or a virologist. No, he wasn't. What he was a darn good policy guy. And that's the problem with our policymakers. They gave up the ghost and gave all the keys of the city to Dr. Fauci to run roughshod over what should be a policy decision, because these things have an impact. The science is one thing. How you apply the science to public policy is a completely different thing.
But also they didn't respond to the specific facts about this disease, which, by the way, they should have known about, since his experiments are the most likely cause of it in the first place. But that's another topic we can explore, which I have been exploring in great detail. They didn't apply the strategy to to the facts of this disease. They got out the old playbook for a different disease, lockdown, and they didn't understand. I don't know what didn't understand. They just didn't engage with the data about the differential risk. That's what's so infuriating about it. Just one quick thing that occurred to me since we've been talking that I just think is such a sort of hilarious example of how insane the whole thing is. Going back to I know it's jumping around a bit, but going back to the masks conversation, I remember spending a good, solid chunk of a good few hours going through some of the studies and whatever, looking at the evidence on masks. And one of them was do you remember the WHO reported, had a recommendation. They changed, just like everyone else, they changed their view on masks. But they had a study on masks, and they listed 8 reasons why people should wear masks in these situations. None of them were to do with preventing the virus. It was like one of them, literally, it was so funny reading it. One of them was to show social solidarity in the fight against it. And one of them, I'm not making this up, was making masks could be an important source of income for people in rural communities.
No.
I promise you, that was one of the 8 reasons that they were, just unbelievable. We're going to have to, I know, it's amazing.
It's unbelievable.
They referred to it elsewhere as a talisman. that was in an actual NIH study saying it may not do much, but it becomes kind of a talisman to ward off these sort of evil spirits of the disease.
Evil spirits.
It's so bad. So let's just wrap it. I want to sort of leave it on the sort of big picture point, which is, it's clearly been I think there's no question that it's been the biggest public policy failure in history. If you just look at the scale of it, the scale of the cost, that we're shelling out to try and make up for these stupid lockdowns and so on. So divorced from reality. The biggest public policy failure in history. Where are we going to get a proper evaluation so we learn the lessons? You've got this ridiculous committee in Congress, totally partisan, called the Coronavirus Response and whatever committee. That's not going to do nothing. What can we do? What can we advocate for or hope for that will have credibility? Because it's become, everyone's on their, on their, side of the argument now. How could we possibly get to some kind of, rigorous, objective evaluation of the whole response that people will have confidence in? Is that even possible?
It's going to be difficult, but we're going to have to do it. And the problem is, it's not just flipping the White House or Congress or Senate. Most of the pain points have come from your local unelected health director who knew that they had so much domain over your life, right? Your state governor and then your county leaders. And so we're going to have to turn all of that over. One of the things we realized very quickly is that something's broke to allow this to happen, right? And so at Rational Ground, we're actually coming up with activist groups that are going around and talking about how do we take the lessons of Florida, where they put in templates now for the counties where the county can declare a 7-day emergency, but after that they have to prove their response and it gets taken down, right? Those sort of triggers that we can have, because right now they just ran roughshod over us with these emergency actions and no one could do anything about it, right? So we need to put in place these sort of triggers. And I think that's what's going to take, is we're going to have metrics and triggers to say, look, this can't happen again. And if you think it needs to happen, you're going to have to demonstrate it. Because we just basically gave up the ghost, and the Faucis around the world, and there's thousands of them, decided to run roughshod over our rights.
Well, look, Justin, that was such a great conversation. I mean, it's great to have your kind of smart perspective on it and the data. It is infuriating, though. It's just every time I talk about it, I just get so upset because of the costs. I mean, these are real costs. I mean, we can sort of have fun, like getting enraged about it. But behind all that anger, that justified anger, are really deep personal costs of all kinds. And it's just
people
very
losing
upsetting.
their jobs.
Yes,
I can't believe we're at the point that people are losing their livelihood.
It's disgusting what's happened. Can I just ask you to tell our viewers and listeners where they can follow your work? You mentioned Rational Ground a few times. Just tell us where everyone can follow you.
My Twitter account is Justin_Hart. We do a lot of our work there, but you can find me at rationalground.com. There's a little subscribe button there. We got a Substack. I do a podcast as well over at Call-In, and we've got a couple other things going on. Look for a new book next year, so that'll be exciting. And there's a lot of things that are coming down the pipeline. Also, a Rational Ground conference. We think somewhere here in the West Coast in April. So we're gonna get people together and ignore all those mask rules and get people all hugging and shaking hands and getting together.
Good for you. We love it. Thank you, Justin. Great to see you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Kristen.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we could have gone on for a whole other hour with him. He was so good.
Yeah, we must have him back. It was absolutely fantastic because he really knows what he's talking about.
He does, and actual real hard facts and data, which I do think is one of the ways to start, rewriting or making sure the proper history is written. He was great. So anyway, we'll have him on again. Thank you so much to everybody for listening, and make sure that you subscribe, follow us on YouTube. Subscribe on Apple, anywhere you get our podcasts, and give us the comments, because we're going to read your comments. They're so great.
We love those comments.
They really
inspiring.
Make
me happy.
Yeah, so
exactly.
Give us a 5-star review, write your comments, and if you want to send us an email at info@californiarebelbase.com. Until next time, thank you.
See you soon.